We can all feel overwhelmed by the demands of everyday life, but it's so important to nurture our soul. And in this episode, we show you how. Welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show with Richard Lawrence. This is the podcast helping seekers of truth, spirituality, and psychic powers to discover true fulfillment. I'm Darren Ball, co-host of the show, and in this episode we'll be sharing 3 ways that you can make time to go within when you're juggling spirituality and life. We'll also be sharing some of the benefits of developing your intuition so that you can make better decisions in life, including your relationships and also finding your life purpose. And then finally, we'll also be sharing the words and the story of a man who spent 8 hours a day for 10 years doing intense yoga practices. And what made him tick? How did he find a way to make time not living in Tibet, but living in London on top of a full-time job? Stay tuned.
Richard.
Hello, Darren.
So today we're talking about an experience I know that people have on a regular basis, which is that it can be very easy, I think, to feel overwhelmed by the demands of everyday life, whatever it is that you're doing.
Yes.
And to feel like that there simply isn't enough time in the day to dedicate to our spiritual practices.
Yes.
And for what it's worth, I think what I want this episode to be is kind of like an antidote to that feeling. Mm-hmm. Because there are definitely some practical strategies and tips that I know that we can share with people that can help them to make time in the day, even if they're juggling spirituality and life and trying to make time for them both. Mm-hmm. And I think also, just kind of as a teaser, I think the person of the week that we want to share this week was certainly an absolute living example of how to do this.
Yeah.
And one that we can model and follow in our lives. But I thought maybe I'd start with maybe asking you what you might offer to people as sort of like your number one sort of recommendation or insight for someone who is struggling to juggle spirituality and life in this way, in order to make time, as they do want to.
Yeah, well, I think the first, it's a fantastic question, and it applies to people in all walks of life and all levels of spiritual dedication. I mean, there are people, Dr. George King was certainly an example of this, who even when he was doing a job, he was a driver, he had bills to pay and everything else, as a young man, he was doing yoga for 8 hours a day as well. So he just focused his whole life on that and did that for 10 years.
Yeah,
which I haven't found anyone else who's even claimed that, not in the West anyway. So that's very unusual while doing a job.
Yeah.
So it all depends, and we're all different, and to the degree and the emphasis we want to give to what. And, what will fulfill some people will not fulfill another person. And I think we've talked about this before, because I think both you and I had very good upbringings, and not a lot of people find the spiritual path through difficulties.
That's true.
I've come across a few people who found it through crises.
Yeah.
Even down a breakdown or a real health crisis has then turned them, or some great abuse that they've suffered, even terrible things like that. And there's turned them in, and then through that, though, they will say that wasn't the best thing that ever happened to them, but in one way it was, because they found the light, they found their path, and it stopped them in their tracks, and so on. So you get that, but in the case of yourself and myself, I think we both had, great families, opportunities, enough money, friends, good schools, and all, but it still wasn't enough for the searching person, any more than it was for someone like Swami Vivekananda. Not that I'm comparing us to someone like that, but he wasn't. He had a very good background, and he was a very successful student, but it just wasn't enough. And then he found his guru Ramakrishna, who said, "You can see God." Can you see God? Yes, I'm looking at him. I'm looking at God now, and that he thought, right, that's what I don't want theory anymore. And of course, he eventually ended up. Well, I believe he's ascended now to extremely advanced master. So it will vary from person to person. What I would say is this: if you do, and I recommend you do, allocate time. Everybody's got some time. You look at the things you do in your day,
sure,
and you'll find there's time. You've got time to do a certain amount of TV watching. You've got time to brush your teeth. Even if you allocated 15 minutes a day.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not limiting you to that, but even if that was all that you gave it, that will improve your life. And look at it this way: the spiritual life is everything. However you regard yourself, spirituality isn't a compartment. Like, I've done a bit of material things, now I've done a bit of emotional things, and now I'll do a bit of spiritual things.
Sure.
It runs through everything. And just to name, I think, perhaps one of the most valuable capabilities in life, intuition. This is something that comes into your whole life, and something that can save you a lot of time and a lot of unnecessary experiences.
Yeah.
So it's actually a good investment of time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's more than that, by the way, a lot more than that. But at one level, it is that. And I can give a couple of examples of that. And this is a very materialistic example I'm going to give now. In my job, which was as secretary of the Aetherius Society, still is actually, we had to purchase a building for the society, and we didn't have a lot of funds. This was just after the passing of Dr. King, so this would be 1998, and roughly. And we had to raise funds, and we had some members who rallied around to buy this building. But first of all, we had to obtain it, and there was a closed bidding session. There was a local school that wanted the same building. This was to be our temple. It's turned out to be one of the best moves we ever made. It's a fantastic place, and it's gained in value, and not that we did it for material reasons. It was in 100% non-profit activity. Nobody gained one material thing from this. It was purely for spiritual purposes, and it's been crucial to our whole functionality for 25 years now. And it took us a long time to get it ready because of funds. But this is the point. There was a closed bidding session, and we were getting professional advice from chartered surveyors and obviously lawyers involved and so on, because we had to place a bid for the school. Now, we didn't have the funds to pay for this. We had to make a big loan, and we were also helped by some donors, but that didn't cover it either. We had to set a price. The chartered surveyors, who were very good, they said, well, you'll definitely get it if you offer such and such. I had a pure intuition. I think some people thought it was insider trading, but it wasn't. I had no knowledge of what other bids were, and you're not allowed to in a closed bid in the UK.
Yeah, I understood, yeah.
And I had a feeling we should go, I think, about £7,000 higher. So that kind of margin than this figure the chartered surveyor had given us. It was pure intuition, and it was on the face of it a waste of £7,000. And we placed that bid, and I found and we got it, and I found afterward, it's now more than doubled in value, of course, since then, but we found afterwards that the local school, private school, the headmistress told me she was really annoyed. She was very friendly, but very annoyed about it, because they were like less than 7,000 lower than us.
So they would have won. Basically.
And they would have won.
Yeah.
Now, that was just pure intuition. Now, that was... I don't think that would have worked, by the way, if it had been a purely materialistic venture.
Sure.
I think the motive goes in with intuition. I had nothing myself personally to gain from this whatsoever, and nor did any other individual at all.
Yeah.
It was purely a spiritual venture. So I think but it's nevertheless, in life, it's just an example of where your intuition, and people will know, they get gut feelings, and you can develop that. Now, doing spiritual practices will help you. By the way, I'm not saying I've got every decision right by a long chalk. I'm just trying to give an example, an important one for us, where intuition can really make a difference in life. And if you do spiritual practices regularly, in my case, I was also a psychic consultant for many years, you will start to develop an intuition. Now, this will only guide you, I feel, towards what you need. It won't necessarily guide you to what you want. And it won't always be enough to get you even to guide you to what you need. You'll need to use logic. You'll need, and in this case, we did all the due... yeah, absolutely. Due diligence and property investigations and you name it, surveys. But it can make all the difference. And it can make let's take another example that people will probably relate to. In relationships, because sometimes your emotions, and let's face it, your attractions, aren't necessarily the best guide to forming a relationship. And I know there's going to be many people who could say, yeah, well, I've experienced that. I picked the wrong person or what have you. You hear about it all the time.
Yeah, sure.
And so again, I mean, if you're lucky enough that the two come together, that the person and the intuition are all one, then that's wonderful. That's another example, though, because by making a wrong judgment in relationships can waste you a lot of time and cause a lot of needless trauma. So there's just a couple of examples of why developing a spiritual life, and they're very basic examples, to be honest, can really be helpful, and why it's worth the time.
No, I think those are great examples because, as you talk about the intuition, often we don't think about the cost of making a wrong decision because you don't see what would have happened otherwise. Yeah. You just see the path that you've gone down. Oh gosh. But yeah, what if we could have made a different decision because of how we might have been inspired by our intuition?
And then let's go to higher things. I mean, Einstein himself attributed to intuition. I mean, let's take Sir Isaac Newton. I mean, he'd watched apples fall off a tree. Everybody had watched apples fall off a tree. They'd think, gravity. Yeah. But you see, all the while, what people don't realize about Sir Isaac Newton, a lot of people, he was spending, as I understand it, more time practicing alchemy, which is a mystical practice, than he was doing physics or science, whatever the study was. Yeah. And that would have prepared him, I believe, so that he'd have the vision to see something. It's not a question, as Proust said, of traveling to new vistas. It's a question of seeing through new eyes. And that's what it gives you. Spiritual practice helps you to see through new eyes.
I think that's another beautiful way to talk about the value of making time for spiritual practice in your life and how it can enrich your life. And there, an example, the profound insight that you may be able to have that you may not have had otherwise.
Yeah.
But I think this all kind of brings it back to this first point here, which is finding our why. Why are we doing this spiritual practice in the first place? What does it mean for our life? How can it make it better? And starting to contemplate what that really means in practical terms for us. And we just mentioned a couple of examples there, and higher things. But I think, especially when you bring it back to the example of Dr. King, who we introduced in the beginning. Yeah. I mean, certainly he was someone who had an extremely strong why.
Oh, yeah. Well, I was in contact, I was in contact with Dr. King. He was a very good friend of mine, a great friend of mine, as well as being my master and teacher. And I spoke to him pretty well every day on the phone. If I wasn't with him in America or he wasn't here, we'd talk sometimes 3 or 4 times a day on the phone, often society, business related, but not always. Sometimes it was just a chat. And sometimes he'd ring me up and he'd say something like this, say, look, we've got to do X, and I don't know why, but I know we've got to do it. And then later on, because he was a man of logic, he was obviously he was a very, very advanced master, so he had access to higher knowledge, and he knew what to do at certain times from his own contact with his true higher self, which was impeccable, really, in my book anyway, as I see it. But he would then apply logic. He would always apply logic, but it didn't always generally come first. Sometimes he'd know what to do first, and then he'd try and find out why.
Interesting. Yeah. That brings those 2 points together, doesn't it?
Can I just add, because the process is different. When you're tapping, you see, one great thing about the intuition is that it can draw on information that isn't accessible to you. Yeah. If you're applying your logic to a situation, you can only apply it to the facts at your disposal. If you tap into your intuition, and sometimes people for example, police workers will say, that they get a gut instinct, they get and it's common in, I think, in a whole variety of works actually, where people just follow gut instincts because they don't really work out what that means or why. But what you're starting to do there is tap into something which is above available information. You're drawing on universal mind. And we talked a bit about that in a previous episode, to the mind that is still the whole universe surrounds. You can draw on other aspect of mind which no one's told you.
Yeah.
And that's crucial if you're going to make... I can only give examples from my own experience, but I remember one occasion that I was very, very impressed to write a sort of very short piece about karma and reincarnation. And I thought, well, I don't know why. I've got no place to put it, but I'll just do this. It was there. I thought I'll do it. And it was perfect conditions to write it, actually. And I just left it there. And then a few days later, Dr. King arrived in England for his trip. And one of the first things he said to me is, I want to bring out a lecture I gave, a booklet we had called Karma and Reincarnation in a new edition. And it exists now. People can find it. And he said, but I need a little forward to it. So I said to him, I said, well, actually, I've written one. And he didn't bat an eyelid. He didn't sort of say, really? He said, bring it here then. Let's have it. And it went into the book almost unaltered.
Amazing.
And and if you buy the book, you'll see the forward.
Yeah.
You can, but I'd written it before I even knew about the book.
Yeah.
Now, you could say, well, you could have written it later. Yes, but when he was over it, the conditions were so busy, it would have been much more difficult.
Yes, exactly.
So it helps you. So another thing it can help you with is timing.
Yes, that's a great point.
There's an unusual case. I'm not saying that happened a lot, but that is a true example of just following your intuition to do the thing that didn't seem to be relevant to anything at that time and turned out to be what was needed. And I certainly don't always get it right, by the way. The one thing about intuition is the intuition is always right. We don't always get it right.
Yeah. There's, I think timing is a big factor. And
it is.
So many different ways.
Oh, so many.
I just one experience came to my head just now. I was, my sister was actually traveling to the UK, and I woke up to a WhatsApp message from my mum saying, hey, she's arriving, I'm going to go meet her. But there was no information about flight details, when she was arriving, what terminal or anything. And so I just looked at it and I immediately thought, I have to leave right now. So I didn't even shower. I just put my clothes on. I ran to the tube station, and I was looking at my phone. I was like, well, I don't even know what terminal to go to. So I just looked at, there were 3 flights coming from Singapore, and I thought, okay, I'm going to choose that one. Go that terminal. Yeah. So then I got to Heathrow, got off at that terminal, ran upstairs, and I ran to the, where everyone comes out of the thing. And as I ran there, she walked out.
Yeah, well, there you are.
In that moment.
That's a very good example.
And her driver walked up next to me. He was like, what's going on? Yeah. And I was like, hey. And she was like, and she was just shocked.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't even give you any information. I was like, I don't know. It just...
Well, that's a very good example. Yeah, excellent. And another thing that, of course, that spiritual practices can do is help your performance. If you have a certain, for example, concentration is something that you develop when you're doing a spiritual practices. That can be applied to anything.
True.
And concentration isn't forcing the mind; it's allowing the mind. I mean, looking back on it, one of the things I did was music. So I remember, I had something I always remembered. I was playing a violin piece for my violin teacher. And first of all, I played it when I really focused in on every note. And he said to me, that wasn't, you need to work more on it. So I came back the next week for my lesson or whatever it was. And the next week, my mind was kind of all over the place. I was about 17 probably then, and I was playing the same piece, but my mind was kind of wandering, and I thought, this isn't very good, because I was thinking about fields, and then I was bringing it back to the... and he said, that's really good at the end. That's strange. Now I understand that, because I've learnt about, the fishing line technique, which we spoke about in a previous episode. I've learnt about what concentration is, which isn't forcing the mind. It's gradually guiding it towards your objective. And this is very useful in life too. So spiritual practices really will alter your life, and also they'll alter in a very, very good way, a service-orientated way, because you will perhaps be driving down a road and there's an accident and the ambulance is on its way, so you don't need to call the ambulance. And instead of just driving on, you might pull over your car and send some healing.
That's a beautiful example.
And you might see someone in distress, or you might be in an office where there is a lot of turbulence, and you're sitting there and you can't do much about it, but you can do a certain spiritual practice like the violet flame practice, which we teach, we've taught before. A wonderful practice is in Realize Your Inner Potential and other books. And this can alter the whole atmosphere in the whole office, and no one will know why. No. Yeah. And I've had many experiences like that, and I know many others have too.
No, I think that's a great point, because as I think you referred to at the beginning of the episode, often there can be a tendency to try and compartmentalize different aspects of your life, but even spirituality, to some 15 minutes or some hour that you spend over here kind of at the end of the day after you've done everything else. But the reality is that you can actually bring these practices, and also the sort of fruit of these practices, throughout the day, and all of these different situations.
And your study. I'm going to throw that in too.
Okay,
and bear in mind there's a service element to doing your practices. It's not just a selfish thing, because you're changing the vibration. Yes. You're changing the energy where you are, and it must travel, and it will affect others. And you can have very sensational effect. I mean, when John Holder and I were up in Hull University when we first found the society, we were really very keen on mantra. I mean, we did it for hours together a day.
Wow.
And
that's inspiring. That's great,
we weren't always getting on with each other every day, but we were always doing mantra together, but that's often we were getting on. But our landlord downstairs was a depressed man. He was a very sad man, and he would just sit there sort of huddled up in a long coat, and he did very morose. And we were upstairs doing this mantra. After we'd been doing this for a few months, he saw us. He said, I'm going to decorate this building. And by the end of it, while we were doing this mantra, he was painting away and humming to himself and do-de-do-de-do-de-do. Really? He completely changed.
Wow.
And that's just a little example. I mean, energy travels, so you aren't just affecting yourself. And when you study a great truth and a great teaching, particularly if it's resonating with you and it's really affecting you inwardly, that's going on to the thought mind belt, which desperately needs thoughts like that. Yeah. The mind of this world is starved of spiritual thought. You are adding to that. So it's not just you going off for yourself and doing something for yourself. You're helping the whole.
How inspiring to think that, wherever we go, we're literally helping to change the vibration.
Absolutely.
And people, right? I mean, I love that story.
I think maybe we did the mantra a bit loud one day, more than we should have done, so don't do this. And he may have heard it. So while we were doing a particular mantra, he was painting the ceiling right below us, going, dum-da-da-da-da-dum-dum-da. It's out loud.
Wow.
So I don't know.
Wow, that's incredible. I like it. I think it's good to tie it back to, as you say, to the service element, and how actually we're changing the world around us, not even just with our study, but with the practice that we do. Because ultimately, when I think again about Dr. King's why, I know that, and you can speak this more than me, that ultimately, his why comes back to the suffering of humanity.
He was here for one reason only. That was his why. He didn't even have to be on this planet. So he was the only person I knew who could honestly put his hand on his heart and then say, every second of every hour of every day, I'm here for one reason only, and that's for the benefit of humanity.
Yeah. I think, it's easy to sort of detach from all the things around us, but, we really tune into what is wrong that's going on. I mean, just our conscience, I should say, and our desire to help others and to want to relieve the suffering that we see around us. If we can find that reason in our spirit practice to see that it helps to make us a better healer, a better channel for spiritual energy, a better prayer, all of these things.
Which it will.
And I mean, we know, I know the people watching this know this, that the feeling of real, true fulfillment that you can find when you're able to do that for somebody.
Well, what doesn't work, and I've seen this happen to a number of people in a number of organizations, and I've had people even come to me for counseling who are quite experienced speakers in other organizations. Well, one person, I would say lots, but one person did. But your inner life has to match your outer life sooner or later. That's very difficult to do. And if your life is a life of service, you've got to be motivated by love. It's got to come from the heart. Can't just come from the lower mind forever. You can see the reason for it, but in the end, you've got to have that motivating force. You've got to feed the heart. And that's what spiritual practices will do.
No, I think that's wonderful. I think I'll leave us with, there's a quote here from Dr. King, one that he shared, which was, if ever there was a time when you could do some lasting good for yourself and humanity, that time is the present, and you have time to do it. I think it goes back to the messages that we've said so much there, and back to his motivation, and back to the fact that, there are a lot of distractions in life that can take us away from what really counts, but beginning to remember our why and the reason why we do these practices and what's important to us, I think can bring us back to find the time to do what's most important. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
I think there's some great takeaways there that we can all apply in order to make spiritual practices more of a mainstay in our life. The first one, of course, is to find our why, to find our motivation, to clarify that motivation, and to use it to inspire us to spend the time going within because of the reward that it gives us. It comes down to being able to develop the latent powers that we have within all of us and being able to use those more in order to help other people. I'm sure that we all agree that nourishing our soul is more important than any of these. And then finally, it doesn't just have to be about making time to sit in meditation or something like that. We can weave it into our everyday life in so many different ways, right? It could be at the office, like the example that Richard gave, or passing someone who's been hurt. I mean, we can make ourselves a channel for spiritual energy. We can radiate this outwards to help them. Two simple examples, right? But in each case, not only are we helping the other person, but we're also, in becoming a channel for energy, raising our consciousness, expressing that love from our heart chakra so that we grow in our spirituality and evolve towards a point of greater spiritual enlightenment. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about making time to go within, then check out this video about tapping into your intuition, or this one over here that goes deeper into how you can be in the world without being of the world. Thanks so much for tuning into the show. We'll see you next time.